What happens to those left behind when a young man dies before his time? Sometimes the young life is treasured by those who knew and loved him, his stories told and retold, until those who remember are also gone, and with them, the memories. 50 years ago, when young Charles Willard Jr. died in Vietnam, his family grieved and told the stories and treasured the memories. They also turned to the church that had nurtured the boy who became the young man and said, "We want to do something to remember our son, our brother."
Dad started talking about it. He said, "I think we ought to have a lecture series." And the thought being that he wanted somebody teaching him about the Old Testament. He said, "That's something that I don't know much about." So they decided that they wanted an Old Testament series, and they wanted to get the best theologians today to speak every year. Mm-hmm. So that's how it started.
I think in the Calvinist tradition, we always understood that education was not an antithesis to faith, but it encouraged faith, and that it encouraged us to pursue knowledge, whether it was science or whether it was literature, history, or whatever. And I think that's, I mean, we're not the only ones that did that, but I think that's been a hallmark of the Presbyterian Church.
Friends of Charles want to make it clear that the Charles they knew in high school and college was an unlikely inspiration for a lecture series at a church. He was a prankster, a cut-up, a charmer, a risk-taker.
Oh, Charles was a piece of work. He knew how to have a good time. He was bright. He just, academia was not his long suit, shall we say. Mm-hmm. But always a bundle of fun. And we played football together. And his parents, particularly his dad, was an avid supporter. I remember this day him cheering on the sidelines, whether we were winning or losing. But Charles was loved by all. He would laugh in some respects that something probably aligned with the church and everything else was in his honor.
Much of my history with Charles Randolph Willard Jr. was as a teenager and then as a college kid.
Right.
Some of those stories we tell, some of those stories we don't tell. So there used to be these television commercials about Volkswagens. And Volkswagens keep water out. So Willard says, his parents are out of town, we're all hanging out over at his house. He says, "You know, Volkswagens will keep water out. They'll probably keep water in, don't you think?" He lived on Roswell Road, and just up the street from Myers Park Baptist Church, and there was a cop that always hung out in that parking lot. He says, "I hate that cop." So he disappears, and we sort of see him walking past on the outside, and then he says, "Where's Willard?" "Oh, I go look." So I go outside, and the guy has 2 garden hoses, and he's filling up the Volkswagen. He puts on an aqualung because he was a skin diver, and he cranks this car up with a face mask on and an aqualung, and he drives it down the street past the cop. He didn't like the cop giving people tickets, so he waited till the cop at the next block pulled him over. So when the cop came up and knocked on his windshield,
oh dear,
Charles opened the door.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Of all my friends, he was the smartest. He had astronomical SAT scores. He had some of the lowest grades in the class because he didn't care. He wasn't motivated. He was bored by it.
School wasn't something that he cared much about. It just came too easy to him.
But he was captain of the football team, captain of the basketball team. I mean, he was the most athletic of my friends. He was the best looking of all my friends. He had the most engaging personality of all my friends. He was the biggest charmer of all my friends. This guy was the total package.
Charles was the full package.
Full of life. I mean, he was the guy who was about as crazy as any one of our friends there. But at the same time, he was also the brightest. He had the most he was most charismatic. I mean, he had more potential than almost any of us.
Lydia gave a print that Charles made to Tom and me years ago. That's a sketch. I think it's a pen and ink drawing of sort of a web, and then there's a small figure in the corner of the painting that's shaped like a man, and it's entitled "Man and Life." And I think Charles was 17 when he made that, and so I thought, wow, that's a forward perspective for a 17, 18-year-old.
We continue to be crestfallen that we didn't get to share our adulthood with him. More importantly, to watch what this guy would have done.
We all sit around and talk now about what Charlie would have been had he come back.
He would have been someone who had really made a difference.
The irony of ironies is that the maturity he clearly took on in Vietnam. I mean, choosing the dangerous regiment that he did within the Rangers, and then volunteering for these missions, which were loaded with, really fraught with danger. So he met an end that probably was not too uncommon, regrettably, for people who were serving in a like capacity there. But he died a hero.
And some people have said to me that the Willard lecture has become as much your parents' legacy as it is your brother's. So it's become the family.
Indeed it has. Indeed it has. And I think that would make them very proud.
How do you think Charles would feel about this as his legacy?
I don't know. I wish I knew him as an adult. That's what I miss most of all, is not knowing him. I knew him as a high school kid who was breaking rules all the time. Let me say first of all that it was with a faith developed in this building that certainly pulled us through. I mean, we realized that God had been with us every step of the way since the day he departed from the country and went over there. That's the most important thing, because I don't know what would have happened to our family had we not had that to hold on to.
Sometimes grief and loss can be transformed and transforming.
Because this was very painful. I mean, their son was just one of the most promising young people in this community, and to lose him in Vietnam, and I knew each year that kind of brought back that pain. I could see it. But they always sort of stood tall, and I asked Charlie one time, I said, "Do you want me to say much about the family?" He said, "Don't say anything about me, but you can say as much about my son as you want to." And I remember going over to their house. I went to dinner with Millard into their house, and they were very prominent. They had a lot of friends. And I asked them, I said, what do y'all like to do? They obviously the children were grown and all that. And they said, well, they said, we go out some, but what we really like to do is stay home and have dinner and dance together. And I thought that's a pretty good endorsement for marriage. I always said every Presbyterian minister ought to have an elder like Charlie Willard.
It was quite obvious that they were devoted to the church. They were very generous and very gracious people. And I would regard the Willard lectures as a real example of the gift of themselves to all of us and our community. The Willard lectures have been directed to very distinguished national figures that have something important to say about the church and its mission. More recently, they have taken on new life and vitality, and I think admirably, more of an extension into the community. It has, I think, quite appropriately and successfully reached out beyond our congregation, and for the folks who have attended them, they would observe that half of the large crowds are people from the community, not members of our church, and represent some real diversity, which I find very encouraging, and I'm sure would delight the Willards.
I think central to the Willard lecture and to this time in our church is a message of hope out of that really deep grief and that awful sacrifice of their son. Came a wonderful community-oriented event.
Sometimes a church and a community can hold the legacy of a young man and his family, and the potential is realized and the memories carried long into the future.